There's a moment in a 1997 interview that Clint Eastwood has never fully explained. The journalist asks him about family, about his children, his relationships, the complicated web of marriages and separations that defined his personal life. Clint pauses. His jaw tightens in that signature way. He looks off camera for a moment, as if deciding how much truth to offer. Then he says simply, "I wasn't always there when I should have been." The interview moves on, but those who knew him understood the weight of that admission. Clint Eastwood built an empire. He became one of the most successful actor-directors in Hollywood history. He made iconic films that defined generations. Dirty Harry, Unforgiven, Million Dollar Baby, Gran Torino. He won Academy Awards. He commanded respect from everyone in the industry. But while he was building that empire, he left behind something he could never quite recover: a family. Multiple families, actually. Children scattered across relationships that began with passion and ended in distance. Wives and partners who tried to hold on to a man who was always moving toward the next project, the next film, the next mountain to climb. Clint Eastwood was a legend on screen, but at home, he was often just absent. And by the time he realized what that absence had cost, by the time he tried to repair the damage, some bridges had burned too thoroughly to rebuild. This is the story behind the tough guy image, behind the westerns and the cop films and the carefully controlled public persona. This is the story of a man who won everything Hollywood had to offer, but lost the people who mattered most, in the quiet reckoning that came too late to change what had already been broken. If you grew up watching movies from the 1960s onward, Clint Eastwood was the definition of American masculinity. Tall, lean, those squinting eyes, and that gravelly voice. A man of few words who let his actions speak louder than dialogue ever could. He started as Rowdy Yates on the TV series Rawhide in 1959, playing a young cowboy for 7 seasons. But it was Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy, a fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly, that made him an international star in the mid-1960s. The man with no name. Poncho, cigar, squint, a character who could kill without flinching and ride off into the sunset without looking back. Then came Dirty Harry in 1971. Inspector Harry Callahan, a San Francisco cop who operated by his own rules, delivered justice with a .44 Magnum and the immortal line, "Go ahead, make my day." Clint became the anti-hero America didn't know it needed. Not a white knight, not a perfect hero, just a man who got the job done, no matter the cost. He transitioned to directing in 1971 with Play Misty for Me and never stopped. The outlaw Josie Wales, Pale Rider, Unforgiven, which won him the Academy Award for Best Director in 1993. Million Dollar Baby in 2004, earning him another Best Director Oscar. He worked constantly, directed over 40 films, acted in dozens more, ran a production company, served as mayor of Carmel, California from 1986 to 1988. He was disciplined, efficient, known for finishing films under budget and ahead of schedule. No drama on set, no ego tantrums, just professionalism and an almost military-level focus. He collected accolades, Academy Awards, Golden Globes, AFI, Lifetime Achievement Award, Kennedy Center Honors, Presidential Medal of Freedom. He married twice, first to Maggie Johnson in 1953, then to Dina Ruiz in 1996, but between and beyond those marriages were numerous relationships that produced children, scandal, and heartbreak. By the time he reached his 80s and 90s, Clint Eastwood had become an elder statesman of Hollywood, respected, revered, an icon. But those closest to him, his children especially, knew a different story. A story about a father who was brilliant on set but unreachable at home. A man who could direct $100 million films but couldn't navigate a conversation about feelings. A legend whose greatest failure wasn't captured on camera. The pattern started early in his first marriage to Maggie Johnson. They married in 1953 when Clint was 23 and still unknown. Maggie was a college student. They were young, in love, building a life together while Clint struggled to break into acting. For years, it seemed solid. They had two children, Kyle, born in 1968, and Allison, born in 1972. But by the late 1950s, Clint's career was taking off with Rawhide, and with that success came attention, women, opportunities, long months away on location. And Clint took advantage. He had affairs, multiple affairs, not discreetly hidden, but not openly acknowledged either. The kind of behavior that was tolerated, even expected, for male stars of that era, but devastating for the wives left at home. In 1964, while still married to Maggie, Clint began a relationship with Roxanne Tunis, a stunt woman and dancer. The affair lasted 14 years. In 1964, Roxanne gave birth to a daughter, Kimber. Clint didn't publicly acknowledge Kimber for years. She grew up knowing who her father was, but rarely seeing him. He provided financial support, but little else. Maggie knew about the affairs, about Kimber. She tried to hold the marriage together, tried to accept the reality of being married to a man who was never fully hers. But the breaking point came in the 1970s when Clint met Sandra Locke. Sandra was an actress. She co-starred with Clint in The Outlaw Josie Wales in 1976. The chemistry was immediate. She was in her early 30s. He was in his mid-40s, still married to Maggie. Clint and Sandra began a relationship that would last 14 years. Though neither divorced their respective spouses immediately, they lived together. She appeared in 6 of his films. Everyone in Hollywood knew they were a couple. Maggie finally filed for divorce in 1978, though it wasn't finalized until 1984. It was one of the most expensive divorces in Hollywood history at the time. Maggie received $25 million, but the real cost wasn't financial. Kyle and Allison, Clint's children with Maggie, were teenagers when their parents' marriage publicly fell apart. They watched their father leave for another woman, watched their mother endure years of humiliation, watched the family they'd known dissolve while their father's career soared. And then, while still with Sandra, Clint did it again. In the early 1980s, he had affairs with other women. In 1986, he had a daughter, Francesca, with actress Frances Fisher. In 1988, another daughter, Morgan, was born. Though the identity of her mother was kept private for years, by the time Clint and Sandra's relationship ended bitterly in 1989, she sued him for palimony and fraud, claiming he'd sabotaged her career. Clint had fathered at least 7 children with 5 different women. Some of them he acknowledged, some he supported financially, but almost none of them got the father they needed, because Clint Eastwood was always somewhere else, on set, on location, building the legend, and the families, were left to figure it out on their own. By the 1990s, Clint Eastwood had achieved a level of success few directors ever reach. Unforgiven, in 1992, was a masterpiece, a deconstruction of the Western genre, a meditation on violence and aging and regret. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Clint was 62 years old, an age when most actors retire, but he was just hitting his stride as a filmmaker. The Bridges of Madison County in 1995 showed his range, a quiet romantic drama that grossed over $180 million worldwide. Mystic River in 2003, Million Dollar Baby in 2004, earning him his second Best Director Oscar. He directed Letters from Iwo Jima and Flags of Our Fathers back-to-back, telling the same World War II battle from American and Japanese perspectives. Both were critically acclaimed. Gran Torino in 2008 became a cultural phenomenon. Clint playing an aging Korean War veteran in Detroit, delivering one of the most iconic performances of his career. He worked into his 80s and 90s. American Sniper in 2014 became the highest grossing film of his career. Sully in 2016. The Mule in 2018. At age 88. He never slowed down, never retired. The work was everything, and Hollywood rewarded him. Awards, honors, retrospectives, a career that spanned 7 decades and showed no signs of stopping. But the children paid the price. Kimber, his daughter, with Roxanne Tunis, grew up in the shadows. She didn't meet her half-siblings until she was an adult. She later said in an interview that she loved her father, but wished he'd been more present. Kyle and Allison, his children with Maggie, had complicated relationships with Clint. Kyle became a successful jazz musician and occasionally acted. Allison became an actress and director. Both spoke carefully in interviews about their father, respectful but distant, acknowledging his talent but hinting at the absence. Francesca, his daughter with Francis Fisher, pursued acting. She appeared in a few of his films, but she too spoke of a father who was more mentor than parent, someone who guided her career but wasn't emotionally available. Scott Eastwood, born in 1986, to Jaslyn Reeves, a relationship Clint also kept quiet for years, became an actor and seemed determined to prove himself on his own terms. He rarely spoke about his father publicly, and when he did, there was an edge to it, a sense of having to earn approval that should have been freely given. And then there were the children whose stories were even more private. Morgan, Catherine, each with their own complicated relationship, with a father who was famous to the world but often a stranger to them. In 1996, at age 66, Clint married Dina Ruiz, a television news anchor, 35 years his junior. They had a daughter, Morgan, a different Morgan from his earlier daughter, in 1996. The marriage lasted 17 years before they separated in 2013 and divorced in 2014. Dina later said that Clint was married to his work first and that she'd accepted that going in, but underestimated how lonely it would be. By his 80s, Clint had 8 children from 6 different relationships. Some were close to him. Some spoke to him occasionally. Some barely knew him at all. He'd built an empire, won every award, made films that would last forever. But the family he'd scattered behind him was fractured in ways that even his discipline and control couldn't fix. It was late 2018, and Clint was at his home in Carmel, California. He'd just finished filming The Mule, playing an elderly drug courier based on a true story. The character was a man who'd prioritized work over family his entire life and was trying, too late, to make amends. The parallels weren't lost on anyone who knew Clint. He sat alone in his study, looking at photographs, pictures of his children at various ages. Some he'd been there for, some he hadn't. Kyle and Allison, his kids, before the divorce. Kimber, in a photo she'd sent him years ago. Scott, on the set of one of his films, trying to prove himself. Francesca at a premiere, smiling but distant. Clint wasn't a sentimental man. He didn't do nostalgia or regret in the way most people did. He was practical, forward-focused. The past was the past. But sitting there, at 88 years old, he couldn't help but wonder, what would it have been like if he'd stayed? If he'd chosen differently? If he'd been the father his children needed instead of the director Hollywood demanded? He thought about Maggie, his first wife, who'd endured years of his affairs and absences. She'd remarried, built a new life. She was fine now, but he wondered if she'd ever forgiven him. He thought about Sandra Locke, who died just months earlier. They'd reconciled somewhat before her death, but the bitterness of their breakup had never fully faded. He thought about all the women who'd loved him, all the children who'd wanted more of him than he knew how to give, and he realized something uncomfortable. He'd been a great director, a great actor, a great storyteller, but he'd been an absent father, and no amount of Oscars could change that. The work had always come first, always, and he'd justified it by telling himself he was providing for them, building something that would last, creating a legacy. But legacy didn't tuck children into bed. Legacy didn't show up at school plays. Legacy didn't have conversations about feelings or fears or dreams. Clint set down the photographs and went back to work because that's what he knew how to do. But for the first time in decades, it didn't feel like enough. The reckoning came slowly, in small moments, rather than one dramatic event. It came in interviews where his children spoke carefully about him, their words polite but revealing in what they didn't say. It came in 2009 when Kyle Eastwood composed the score for his father's film, Gran Torino, and their collaboration felt more professional than personal. It came in 2018 when The Mule was released, and critics noted how the film seemed to be Clint's meditation on his own life, a man who'd chosen work over family and was only now, at the end, realizing what he'd lost. It came when Dina, his second wife, spoke publicly after their divorce about the loneliness of being married to someone who was always emotionally elsewhere. And it came in his 80s and 90s when Clint, still working, still directing, still determined to add to the empire, began reaching out to his children more, not in grand gestures. Clint didn't do grand gestures in his personal life, but in small ways. Phone calls that were a little longer, invitations to visit that were a little more frequent, questions about their lives that went a little deeper. Some of his children responded warmly, others remained distant. The wounds of decades don't heal overnight, if they heal at all. In 2021, Clint directed Cry Macho at age 91, playing an aging rodeo star who befriends a young boy and becomes a father figure to him, the role he'd struggled with in real life. The film wasn't his best work. Critics were mixed, but those who knew Clint understood what he was doing. He was still processing, still trying to understand, still working through the choices he'd made, because that's what Clint Eastwood did. He worked, even when the work was facing his own failures. Here's what most people never understood about Clint Eastwood. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't cruel or vindictive or intentionally destructive. He was just a man who loved his work more than he knew how to love the people around him. He came from a generation that defined masculinity as strength, stoicism, and providing. Emotions were weakness. Vulnerability was failure. You showed love through paychecks, not presents. And Clint embodied that philosophy completely. He provided for his children financially, gave them opportunities, opened doors in Hollywood when they wanted them, paid for the best schools, made sure they were taken care of. But he didn't give them himself. He didn't sit with them through the hard moments, didn't ask about their feelings, didn't share his own struggles or fears or doubts. He was a great director because he had total control. He could shape a film exactly how he wanted it. He could fix problems. He could create something perfect. But people aren't films. Children aren't projects. Relationships require vulnerability, compromise, presence, all the things Clint had spent his entire life avoiding. The tragedy isn't that he was a terrible father. It's that he was capable of being a good one, but never figured out how. He loved his children. He was proud of them. But love without presence is just an abstraction. And by the time he understood that, by the time he tried to bridge the distance, decades had passed, and some of his children had built lives that didn't have space for him anymore. Clint Eastwood is 94 years old now, still living in Carmel, still working occasionally, still the same disciplined, controlled presence he's always been. His children are scattered across the country, each with their own careers, families, and relationships, with a father who was larger than life, but often smaller than they needed. Some are close to him, some speak occasionally, Some have made peace with who he was and what he couldn't give. Some are still working through it. There will be no dramatic reconciliation scene, no Hollywood ending where everyone gathers around and heals through tears and apologies, because that's not who Clint is. And in his own way, that's okay. He's made great films. He's told important stories. He's built a legacy that will outlast him by generations. But the real story, the human story, isn't in the awards or the box office numbers or the critical acclaim. It's in the complicated relationships with the 8 children who carry his name but didn't always have his attention. It's in the recognition that you can be brilliant at your work and still fail at the things that matter most. It's in the lesson that presence matters more than success. That being there matters more than providing. That emotional availability matters more than financial security. Clint Eastwood was the man with no name, but his children always knew his name. They just didn't always know the man behind it. Some stories aren't about redemption. They're about living with choices that can't be undone, about understanding that even legends are just people who make mistakes, and about the families left behind when someone chooses the work over the ones they love. And some stories stay with us forever. If this quiet story touched you, feel free to subscribe and join us for more forgotten American lives.